Hello, students, and welcome to Chapter 6, where we return to the unification of Egypt, or the reunification of Egypt, under some new dynasties. This is actually a relatively short period of Egyptian time, you might say. This is really just the 11th and 12th dynasties before we come up on the second intermediate period. And we'll see some differences here between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, one of which is the way the funerary complexes were designed. On this slide, actually the introductory slide, you're seeing the funerary complex of Amenhotep, and we'll talk about that. We'll also see how it appears that the technology to build pyramids was somehow lost between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. And you'll see what I mean when we look at what remains of those pyramids from that period. The other thing that you want to keep in mind for the Middle Kingdom, it's very interesting. In ancient times, people really did not honor monuments in the way that we do today. Today, something that we might leave standing for eternity or whatever because we're honoring the memory of someone was not that important to them. And so a lot of things from the Middle Kingdom were actually pilfered, blocks of granite, blocks of a variety of things that were used as building materials were pilfered during the New Kingdom by New Kingdom pharaohs for their building projects. So unfortunately, there's a lot of things from the Middle Kingdom that we don't have for that purpose. But in any case, let's begin. So we come up on the 11th dynasty, and as we saw in the last chapter, Nebhepetra Montuhotep reunified Egypt, and as it says in the slide here, gradually over a number of years. Following his final victory in the 10th dynasty by his regnal year, and what regnal year means is the year of his reign. So the 40th year of the reign, 40th year of his reign at the latest, Egypt had a strong central government. So this meant that after a hiatus of about a century, the South now had access again to the North, including Old Kingdom monuments in the Memphite necropolis. And artistic evidence suggests that the king deliberately ordered a style influenced by 5th and 6th dynasty Memphite models to be adopted in the decoration of his monuments, basically using that as a way of tying himself back to the Old Kingdom. And then the elite followed his lead because the pre-unification Theban relief style that we saw in Chapter 5 all but disappears at this time. And the reason for the change was ideological. This is not really unusual for a ruler to want to take something old and use it to promote himself. So he was abandoning a style that was developed during the chaos of the division period and returning to models that derived from a strong period of centralized rule to show he was strong, and showing a corresponding return to the political ideals of the Old Kingdom and a renewal of a centralized state. And so here we have a lovely depiction of the Semitawi hieroglyph, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. So the monuments after that date can usually be distinguished by their style of decoration. And raised or sunk relief becomes very low or very shallow, so they're not carving very deeply into the stone, and the surface within the outlines tends to be flat with little incised detail. And in the human figure, the exaggerated eye in many cases becomes smaller, as does the ear, and the outstretched hand regains a slight curve to the fingers. Male figures exhibit musculature, broad shoulders, and a low small of the back, and piles of offerings touch and interlock, and the reed leaf loaves on offering tables turn inwards. And despite the reunification of Egypt and the adoption of a relief style based on northern models, Montuhotep did not return his residence or burial complex to Memphis, and he didn't model his mortuary complex on the architecture of the Old Kingdom pyramid complex. Instead, he maintained his residence at Thebes and continued work on a funerary complex he'd begun on the West Bank at Deir al-Bahri. And here you can see a floor plan of that. And during the long period of the construction of the complex, complex that underwent several changes of plan, as you can imagine. And we've seen that the tombs of the wives of Mentuhotep belong to an early stage of the design when their entrances were intended to be out in the open air. The king's first burial chamber, the Bab el Hassan, belonged to the same phase, but later a new burial chamber was constructed farther to the west. And this just gives you an elevation, kind of a side cutaway view with the burial chamber going that way. And it's also thought that there might have been a pyramid at one time. It no longer is there, but the greater part of the temple was built on top of a large raised platform, and it was faced in limestone and may have reached almost 33 feet in height. And as I said, we think that this might have been the base for a pyramid, and it's now believed to have had a flat top and possibly been meant to represent the primordial mound on which all creation took place in Egyptian mythology. And it may also have had links to similar features in early solar temples or even in the early dynastic funerary enclosures at Abydos. And it was surrounded on all sides. Here's a nice photo of what it looks like today, so you see what I mean by, yeah, not much remains. But it was surrounded on all sides by an ambulatory with octagonal sandstone pillars enclosed by a thick limestone wall, and it was into this wall that the 6 tomb chapels of the royal women were incorporated. And then to the west of the ambulatory, cut back into the cliffs, was the rear part of the temple, and an open court with pillared porticos on the east, north, and south sides contained the entrance to the king's later burial chamber. And then an underground corridor that ran nearly a mile into the cliff ended in a chamber lined with granite that contained a calcite shrine. And that was robbed long before modern excavators even ever got to it. Not unusual in the ancient world. And above ground to the west of the open court was a hypostyle hall with 10 rows of 8 columns, and a niche for the king's statue was cut in the middle of the west wall. And then in the final building stages, upper colonnades were added in front of the north, east, and south walls around the ambulatory, which, by the way, ambulatory means a place to amble, a place to walk, so a place where people could walk or the priests could walk. A lower colonnade was erected in front of the east side of the platform on which the temple was built, to either side of the ramp that led up onto the platform from the large forecourt below. And then a 3-corridor unroofed causeway led up to the walled forecourt from a building at the edge of the cultivation, which is now lost. And then the inner sides of the stone walls were probably lined with standing sandstone statues of the king, much like this one, while others were erected in the forecourt along the processional way. And all of these wore the knee-length wrap around the said festival cloak, and the king was holding the crook and flail across his chest. And all the statues on the south side probably had the white crown of Upper Egypt, and then on the north side they would have worn the red crown of Lower Egypt. And at the rear of the temple, at the west end of the hypostyle hall, 4 columns from each of the 2 central rows were enclosed with limestone blocks to make a sanctuary directly in front of the statue niche. And the temple within throughout was decorated with relief scenes, and these were painted, and today we have only fragments that we can only reconstruct in part. Both the style and the subject matter were modeled in large part on the pyramid complexes of the 5th and 6th dynasties. And in the front half of the temple are our usual scenes that show the king as the victor over chaos, defeating his enemies in battle, hunting animals in the desert, harpooning hippopotamuses, and fishing and fowling in the marshes. And others depicted ritual processions of boats, official cult scenes, and on the pillars of the upper colonnade, the king being embraced by various deities. And at the rear of the temple, the sanctuary was decorated with scenes belonging to the cults of the king and Amun-Ra, and also showing the ritual role of the king in relationship to the gods, offering to them and being embraced by them. And on the east end of the exterior north wall, the king appears seated on a throne with the Semitawi motif between Horus and the goddess Wadjet of Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, and Seth Neth and Nekhbet of Upper Egypt, the two gods handing the king the symbol for millions of years. And I believe you'll notice on some of these slides there's little numbers on the images, and I think some of that is because the excavators are trying to recreate things that have been pulled apart, and so that's a system for keeping everything, kind of recorded so they know where it came from and possibly where to put it, I'm guessing. So the complex was far grander than the tombs of Montuhotep's predecessors at El Tarif, but it was related to the same Theban tradition with a large forecourt and no pyramid. Even the idea of pillared porticos might have derived from the rock-cut pillared facades of earlier tombs. These tombs were largely undecorated except for stelae set up in connection with them. And after obtaining access to Old Kingdom pyramid complexes, Montuhotep used their decorative programs as a model for the subject matter of the reliefs on the front part of the temple. And the stylistic change that we have in relief is not apparent in statuary. The statues that were set up in the mortuary complex belong to the final stage of the building, but maintain a lot of the facial characteristics of the pre-unification style. So the large eyes have emphasized inner canthi. The canthi is that place near the tear duct that turn down, and cosmetic lines that flare out at the other end. And the eyebrows, modeled in relief, run straight above the eye, and the nose is broad with pronounced wings, and the lips are thick and the ears large. Nebhepetra Montuhotep built widely in Upper Egypt after the reunification. This is something that rulers do. They want to show that they have the power and they have the money to do this, and having large building programs is a way of showing that. But unfortunately, as I said, none of his buildings have survived because a lot of the New Kingdom pharaohs basically just took his building material and used it in their own projects, which seems crazy to us today. So a lot of these things are fragments that show up in other structures, and some people have tried to put them back together again, so that's kind of interesting. And the surviving fragments that we do have show that the pre-unification relief style was used on royal monuments, and no material of Montuhotep has been found north of Abydos, which shows maybe there was a lack of interest in the northern part of the country, but the absence may also be due to chances of survival. And a barely begun funerary complex that lies to the south of the complex of Nebhepetra Montuhotep was once thought to have belonged to his immediate successor, Sankara Montuhotep. However, it's been shown that in fact it was the work of Amenemhat, who was the first king of the 12th dynasty, begun before he moved the royal residence and funerary complex to the north. So to this date, we don't know where Sankara Montuhotep and his successor Nebtawira Montuhotep sited their complexes. But we do have this statue of Sankara Montuhotep, who is also known as Montuhotep III. And although there's no temple buildings still standing from this period, blocks of Sankara Montuhotep reused in later buildings are known from a number of Upper Egyptian sites. And they do show reliefs of the very high quality, and also show a change from the flat plain relief of Nebhepetra, where, as you can see in this relief here, there was modeling, the forms are more rounded, and there's more incised detail. So we have an interesting change from the 11th to the 12th dynasty. And dynasties are basically, ruling families. So new ruling family with the 12th dynasty. So Nebtawira Montuhotep was the last king of the 11th dynasty, and he had a vizier probably known as Amenemhat, and Amenemhat is the official who became the king of the 12th dynasty. And like the kings of the 11th dynasty, he was probably of southern origin and probably began ruling from Thebes. And the means by which he became king are unclear. It's very possible he might have been Nebtawira's appointed successor, or he might have seized the throne. However, it's interesting, he is omitted from the later king lists, but Amenemhat is included as a legitimate ruler. And this happens throughout Egyptian culture, I guess, as the political tide turns, people's names get omitted. The Ramesside kings, the kings known as Ramses, actually omitted the entire 18th dynasty. They were just horrified by it, but we'll get to that later. So Senwosret I, and you'll see different spellings of that actually on the slide itself. There's one spelling and then another. So if you're doing research on him for whatever reason, those are some of the different spellings. So Senwosret I was the second king of the 12th dynasty, and this is where things get kind of interesting. His father, Amenemhat I, was murdered, and this apparently had been a harem plot, and these also happen throughout Egyptian history. Basically, it's an assassination carried out. They call it a harem plot because the king would have had many wives, and those wives all wanted their sons to become king. So they call it a harem plot because probably the mother and the son together had something to do with the assassination. So Amenemhat I was assassinated in the absence of his son, who was off fighting in Libya. And it would seem that his son either swiftly left the campaign or was already heading home at the time of the murder. And this was not the first harem conspiracy. And Amenemhat I had tried to perform due diligence in respect to assuring a successful transition for his heir. And for the first time that we know of in Egyptian history, Senwosret I was made a co-regent in the 20th year of Amenemhat's rule. So by the time of his father's death, he was firmly established as the heir to the throne. But regardless of the intentions of the conspirators, he still managed to ascend the throne with little difficulty. And after setting up his government at Thebes, he began his own funerary complex on the West Bank. And like the 11th dynasty rulers, he may have at first tended to ignore Lower Egypt, but resistance to his rule might have come from people in Lower Egypt. So once he subdued the Delta, i.e. Lower Egypt and its border regions, he probably realized that he could not successfully rule Egypt from the south, and so he moved his royal residence to the north. And at some point in his reign, he changed the first three names of his fivefold titulary, and this alteration may have marked the transference of the residents from the south. So initially, he may have moved to the Old Kingdom capital at Memphis, and even have begun to prepare a funerary complex at Saqqara. Eventually, he built a new royal residence named with the royal epithet Ijtawi, he who takes possession of the two lands. And although this site has never been located, its necropolis, where Amenemhat built his first funerary complex, was at Licht, a little north of Meidum. So when the young prince, Senwosret, returned from his military campaign in Libya, he learned that Amenemhat had been the victim of a palace plot and had been assassinated. And having ruled as co-regent with his father since the age of 10, he took control of the throne at this point. And there's actually a story, a kind of a novel that was written about this called The Tale of Sinuhe. And that's one of the most popular stories in Egyptian literature. And it recounts the life of a loyal palace employee who goes through a number of things and remains loyal to his king. And Senwosret continued the conquests that had been made by Amenemhat I. So in Nubia, he extended his control as far as the Third Cataract, which is in present-day Sudan. And then up in the west, he reinforced Egyptian garrisons up to the Libyan coast. And then he entered into fruitful trading relationships with Syria, Palestine, and exploited the gold mines and stone quarries in his territory. And little evidence remains of Senwosret the builder, for reasons I've already noted, but he was involved in the enlargement of the temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. He also restored the temple of the sun god at Heliopolis. City of the Sun, of which a 66-foot-high obelisk is all that remains. Senwosret also encouraged the writers who produced the classics, like The Tale of Sinuhe, The Instruction of Amenemhat I, and The Loyalist's Instruction. He made his son, the future co-regent Amenemhat II, co-regent 4 years before his own death. So I actually have 2 slides that say the same thing on them, but I'm going to explain. So the king and his pyramid complex. The kings of the 12th dynasty were buried in pyramid complexes that were modeled on those of the 5th and 6th dynasties. And as I said, we think, somehow they lost the technology to create pyramids as successfully. So the older models were never copied exactly. And new methods of pyramid construction were introduced that were less effective than the old ones. And as we'll see in the next slide, the pyramids of the 12th dynasty have not survived well at all. In contrast to the standardization of the 6th dynasty, they used a variety of heights, base lengths, and angles. However, the elements of the whole complex with the Valley Temple, Causeway, Mortuary Temple, and Pyramid all follow the Old Kingdom tradition. So get ready. Here we see the plan for Amenemhat's pyramid. And, in theory, on paper, it looks pretty good. This is what survives. They pretty much just look like big piles of sand and rubble. The insides still contain, angles and things like that. But the exteriors are pretty sad looking, as you can see. Here's another one. Senwosret's monument was originally larger than his father, built to the same plan, and his architects used a new technique that was used by Senwosret II and throughout the Middle Kingdom, in which a core of limestone block walls radiated from the center of the structure, and the spaces were filled in with unfired mud brick and debris before then being covered with a Tura limestone casing. Supposedly it was supposed to be stronger. Well, you can kind of see the end result, not so fabulous. The entrance, which you can still find, opened in a pavement at ground level on the north side of the structure with an entrance chapel covering it, and it would have had fragments of colored reliefs, and they found those from the chapel, as well as fragments of an altar and an alabaster false door stela. There were also water spouts in the shape of lions' heads, similar to those found in later temples, to drain water away from the roof. The entrance passage sloped downwards, then turned towards the southeast, but like Amenemhat's burial chamber, this is now underwater. Another tunnel was dug below the entrance passage to facilitate the transporting of materials into the burial chamber, which was probably blocked up upon completion of the pyramid. And it's believed that the burial chamber was robbed shortly after it had been sealed, although there were remains of the king's funerary goods found in the robbers' tunnel. And the complex is surrounded by a double perimeter wall, the first enclosing part of the King's Mortuary Temple on the eastern side, and then a small satellite period at the southeast corner. And the inside of the first perimeter was uniquely decorated here. You can just barely make out probably the feet of images of fertility gods, and there also would have been reliefs with the king's name as well. So Senwosret's funerary temple is almost completely destroyed, although better preserved a little bit than his father, so it's easier for archaeologists to reconstruct the plan. And this conformed to the funerary temples of the 6th dynasty, with remains of a courtyard and portico that once had 24 pillars and an offering hall flanked by storerooms. And during excavations by Gautier in 1894 in the area of the mortuary temple, they found 10 life-size limestone statues of Senwosret in a pit between 2 subsidiary temples, and they now reside at the Cairo Museum. And then 9 more, pretty pathetic looking, 9 more secondary pyramids for female members of the king's family were found inside the outer mud brick enclosure wall, and 7 of the small pyramids had their own funerary temple and enclosure wall, and the last 2 on the northern side shared an enclosure. Only 2 of the names of the royal ladies have been uncovered so far, those of Neruru, or Nofret, sometimes known as the wife and sister of Senwosret, and Itaket, or Itaxiet, who was probably Senwosret's daughter. And an open causeway connected the mortuary temple to the valley temple, which has not yet been precisely located. And today, the causeway's walls, which were once decorated with reliefs, are still visible in places. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what the pyramid might have actually looked like during the Middle Kingdom. And the stone walls of the causeway were flanked on either side by white plastered mud brick walls, as you could see in that recreation. And that also contributed to 3 corridors within the causeway. And we don't have this in the Old Kingdom, but it was first seen in Nebhepetra Montuhotep's complex. And it was adopted in all 12th century causeways. In addition to relief decoration, the causeway also contained a series of statues of the king. Niches would have been cut into the later interior wall every 10 cubits, and in each niche was a life-size mummiform statue of Senwosret. And mummiform basically means you can sort of see it looks like a standing figure that would have been wrapped up like a mummy. And like the 3-corridor causeway, the statues depart from the Old Kingdom tradition and may have been influenced by those that line Nebhepetra's unroofed causeway. And unlike those statues, the figures of Senwosret lean against massive back pillars. And these pillars and the statue bases were painted pink to imitate granite. And the transition between the outer and inner parts of the temple was marked by the traditional transverse corridor, and both this element and the inner part of the temple are poorly preserved, although the plan of the 5 statue chapels linked by 2 rooms to the offering chamber can be traced, and fragments of wall relief from the offering chamber depicting processions of offering bearers is worked in high raised relief. And then the inner enclosure wall that ran around the pyramid and inner part of the mortuary temple was unlike any other existing enclosure wall. It was made of limestone and decorated with 100 regularly spaced panels on both inside and outside, and the panels were carved with outsized renderings of the king's Horus name, which you can see here with the Horus sitting on top of the Serech. And at the top, carved in great detail and in very high rounded relief, was the Horus falcon, as I said, wearing the double crown. And then below, with the rectangular enclosure of the Serech has the version of the king's Horus name together with either his throne name Keperkara or his given name Senwosret, and then the latter 2 alternating on the panels. And beneath the Horus name was a life-size fecundity figure that represented the prosperity of Egypt. And in the middle of the west wall, 2 panels were placed closer together with the fecundity figures standing back to back. And this is actually on the right here. You can see a nice rendering. So this would be our fertility figure here. And from there, they proceeded in 2 great processions around the walls, moving towards the east side as though they were going into the temple. So local temples. So kings of the 12th dynasty built throughout Egypt. However, local temples were still mainly made of mud brick with stone elements, so little survives to this day. And again, part of this is because they would replace earlier temples and take parts away from them. Our knowledge of temple decoration derives from relief-cut blocks that were discovered reused in later buildings, and the most common themes depicted show the interaction between the king and the gods. The king is the performer of the cult for the deities, and the deities are bestowers of gifts on the king and the legitimators of the king's rule. So the town of Koptos, at the west, or at the entrance to the Wadi Hammamat, leading to the eastern desert, and then eventually onto the Red Sea, was the cult center of the Ithyphallic god Min. Yes, he of the erect penis. Today, the buildings on the site are mostly Ptolemaic in date, but colossal statues of Min found here dating to the late pre-dynastic period show that there was a long history of temple building. And there's no complete structures that survive from the Middle Kingdom because blocks from buildings of both Amenemhat and Senwosret were, as I've said again and again, were found reused in later temples. So this is a scene preserved on 2 blocks showing Senwosret running between territorial markers before Min. And that's Min on the right. I think you can guess which one he is. The speech of the god refers to a performance of the Sed festival, and the scene may refer to the Sed festival celebrated by Senwosret actually in his year 31. And although it's not complete, there's enough remaining to show the high quality that artists had at that time, and it's worked in very deep sunk relief with the interior details of the hieroglyphs, the feathers, and the collar of Min, and the king's kilt all cut into the stone. And the figures are modeled within their outlines. The muscles of the king's rear arm, where he's holding a long oar, are bulging with tension, and the muscles of the rear leg also show the physical effort of running. And despite this energetic action, the figure is held suspended within a balanced composition. And we've already discussed the rise to prominence of Amun-Ra during the 11th dynasty, and the center of his cult at Thebes laid on the east bank of the Nile at the site that we know today as Karnak. And as at Koptos, we know very little about the Middle Kingdom buildings, again, because they were all replaced in the 18th dynasty, but Middle Kingdom blocks survive because they were used again in later buildings, and a lot of them are isolated out of context, but archaeologists are trying to reconstruct the Middle Kingdom complex on paper. And in addition, most of the blocks survive from a small way station chapel of Senwosret, which allowed archaeologists to actually reconstruct it and display it at the open air museum at Karnak. And the chapel was built on a platform and reached by 2 stepped ramps placed on opposite sides of the square building, and 12 pillars linked by low balustrades form the exterior sides of the chapel. And here you can see an artist's rendering of it where they've tried to make some of the carvings a little bit more crisp, but it's still kind of hard to see in the slide, I know. And these surrounded 4 freestanding pillars in the interior, making 4 rows of 4 pillars in each direction. Here you can see the carvings a little bit better. And this has become known, as you can see right there on the slide, as the White Chapel. And what you also see at the center here is a stand on which the sacred boat of Amun would have been rested during processions. And then the pillars themselves are decorated with reliefs consisting of long columns of text at the top relating to a scene below in which the king ritually interacts with Amun-Ra and other deities, under which 2 horizontal lines contain references to the first occasion of the Sed festival. And this is a style of very high relief that you can see it's projecting out much more strongly from the wall. It's similar to those at Licht and equivalent to the deep sunk style at Koptos, so that suggests that one style, maybe emanating from the royal workshops, was in use on royal projects throughout the country. And in the chapel, the raised relief is subtly modeled with the body contours and the musculature indicated. And in addition, the interior details of hieroglyphs, the god's feathers, some crowns, jewelry, and costume are cut into the stone. And other blocks from the main temple complex at Karnak show the same style of high relief and high quality artistry, but use less modeling with little if any interior detail cut into the stone. And this indicates that within the overall royal style there could be differences, and that perhaps shows that artists from different workshops were doing the work. And then fragments of the statues of the king have also been found at Karnak, and we have to assume that they were an important part of the architecture. And some of these were in the shape of the mummiform statues, which we already saw in the king's funerary complex. And these identify the king with the resurrected god Osiris and guarantee his survival into the next life. Indeed, when they have their arms crossed like this, often there's a crook and a flail. In this case, he's holding two ankhs, but that's showing, that's called the Osiris position, essentially, and just as in this case, reflecting eternal life. So private funerary art. So for the people who were perhaps high-ranking officials but not quite royalty, they were continued to be buried in tombs with a chapel above the burial shaft, and members of the central government built freestanding mastabas, or bench-like tombs, in the cemeteries near the pyramid of the king that they served. Provincial governors were buried, as earlier, in decorated rock-cut tombs in their own local cemeteries at sites such as Beni Hassan, Bersha, Mayer, Asyut, Kal el Kabir, and Aswan. The repertory of decoration was similar to the things we saw in the Old Kingdom, since the function of the tomb chapel was the same, to provide a place for the performance of the funerary rituals and so forth. However, in the Middle Kingdom, statues were placed in the tomb chapel itself, often in niches or shrines at the back that formed the focal point for the cult. So we will see that. And funerary stelae expand on the traditional image of the deceased sitting in front of a table of offerings. In addition to the deceased and his wife, other family members, deceased or living, are frequently shown, and the text usually includes the offering formula and sometimes a more or less formulaic biographical text. And there's no one standard type of funerary stela. They might have been rectangular, they might have been round-topped, there's a lot of different kinds. The number of registers and figures vary, as do the disposition and the amount of text, and also the quality of the workmanship, probably reflected in whatever the deceased's family could afford. And the owner of the stela was the most important person represented. Here we have him seated and on the left, facing right. And if there's more than one register, he's usually placed in the highest because higher registers take precedence over lower ones. So this is probably him again. And then if the deceased's wife shows up, she takes a secondary position behind her husband. You can see her here a little bit. She's kind of faded. And she's thus further away from the center of the scene and the action. She's often also a lot smaller. And living family members are usually shown offering and face left towards the deceased, just as they would face the statue of the deceased in the tomb chapel. And compositions become more complex when deceased relatives are included, and they may be depicted in the same register as the owner of the stela, but in a less prestigious left-facing position on the right. So here we have, you can kind of see people facing to the left and to the right. Also note these sort of grid lines along here. We're going to come back to that later. And you can also see a bit down here. This is an unfinished stela, so we're going to come back to this in a later slide. Coffins were decorated on the inside, and they continued to place a false door that we see here on the north end of the east side next to the face of the occupant. And then beside this would be a pile of offerings and also an offering list. And on the opposite side and often on the ends of the coffin would be painted a frieze of objects including articles of clothing and jewelry, mirrors, furniture, games, tools, weapons, ritual items, and different kinds of vessels. And even here we've got some fowl hanging up so that, you know, they can have some duck or goose in the afterlife. And another thing we start to see are groups of servants, and they're doing all kinds of things. They're engaged in a variety of activities and continue to be placed in the tomb either in hidden niches cut in the floor and paved over, or placed inside with the coffin and the burial chamber. And at this period, additional themes were added to the repertory of model granaries, boats, offering bringers, and food production that had been in vogue since the Old Kingdom. And now models show workshops for woodworking, metalworking, pottery making, and weaving, and the models of the first intermediate period had seldom been of high artistic quality, and those in the late 11th and 12th dynasties also varied in craftsmanship. And the 24 models from the tomb of the Chancellor Meketre at Thebes, now dated to the early 12th century, or dynasty, sorry, are amongst the finest that were produced. In addition, at the head end of the coffin, you would see depictions of the 7 oils that were used in the opening of the mouth ceremony, granaries to provide a perennial store of food, and also headrests used by the Egyptians to support the head in sleep and death. And this image is actually from King Tut's tomb, but it's showing the opening of the mouth ceremony, where the mummy's mouth would be ceremonially opened so that he could breathe in the afterlife. And then at the foot end of the coffin, you would have sandals represented, and on the sides of it, 1 or more bands of hieroglyphs carrying versions of the offering formula above the rest of the decoration. And the decorations, as you can see here from this little detail, were painted in bright colors, and in many cases they have a very high quality. And the hieroglyphs themselves are often works of art and combine different colors and have very careful detailing, such as the plumage and the birds that you can see in this close-up. And the function of the decoration, as always, was to ensure that the deceased would have everything that he or she could need in the afterlife. And then further texts were written on the inner sides of coffins that are now known as coffin texts. So if you remember from the Old Kingdom or pyramid texts, these are the descendants of those, but now they have new material. They have things like guides to the hereafter, often with a map, and these would help the deceased to make the transition into the next world safely. So we're going to look at some memorial chapels, and by the Middle Kingdom, Abydos was the major cult center for Osiris, the resurrected god who presided over the underworld, and the rituals at his temple included the annual festival that reenacted his death and his triumphant resurrection, and every year the statue of Osiris would be taken from the temple to his mythical tomb, and then having overcome his enemies, the resurrected god would be returned with great rejoicing to the temple. And this is actually thought to maybe have been the ceremonial tomb of Osiris at Abydos. And so it was custom for the elite at this point to build memorial chapels near the enclosure of the Osiris temple along what was probably the processional way used in the festival. And then after the Middle Kingdom, sadly, these buildings were abandoned and built over. And so, as a result of this, excavators from the 19th century found and removed from these chapels large numbers of stelae that are in museum collections around the world. This is one thing from both the 18th and 19th century that, is not such a great thing. Lots of people thought they could just take things out of Egypt and, sell them off to museums. So what you're looking at is a stela from the Chapel of Ebe, which is in a museum in Florence, Italy. So originally these stelae would have been placed in niches within the chapels or cut into the walls of the courtyard that fronted the chapels. And they're very similar in design to funerary stelae showing the deceased, as you see here, in some cases with his wife and other family members seated before a table of offerings. And then the main inscription usually consists of the offering formula in favor of the deceased and will sometimes include a biographical text. And in some instances, statues were included in the chapels, and it's clear that these buildings were not associated with the tombs themselves. Excuse my typo there. So the building were not near the actual tomb of the deceased. So basically what you're doing is by erecting a chapel in the vicinity of Osiris and the processional way, the owner of this stela is associating himself and his family with the rituals carried out there for the god, and especially with the triumph of the resurrected god during his annual festival. So essentially, They want to happen to them what happened to Osiris. They want to be resurrected in the afterlife. So the owners of these chapels are buried elsewhere, but they could continue to derive benefit from the chapels after death. And what you're looking at here is a limestone block from a high official under Amenemhat II, and I'm going to talk about this little statue here, or what these little statues are like, because we start seeing these during the Middle Kingdom in a moment. But first, looking at the development of the squared grid system. Now, if you've purchased the book, they go into exquisite detail about the differences between the grid system of the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. I'm giving you kind of the basic info about that. I'm not going to test you on the exactness of it because it's a lot to know. But basically, this is an image showing you that the red lines represent the system that was used in the Old Kingdom, and then the addition of the white graph is indicative of the system that was used from the Middle Kingdom to the late period. So they basically reintroduced the Memphite style after reunification, and the proportions of the figures returned to those of the 5th and 6th dynasties and were continued to be used during the first half of the 12th dynasty. However, it shifts a little bit later on. So here we have the black granite seated statue of the high official Amenemhat, and this is a good example of male proportion in this period. There's modeling in his bare torso, so you can see the muscles in his broad shoulders, his chest, and his upper arms. And then this is coming back to that slide where you can kind of see a grid, and we'll actually look at a close-up of this. So this is an unfinished scene from the 12th dynasty to show that sketches were laid out on a squared grid, and standing figures always comprise 18 squares between the soles of the feet and the hairline. So if we drew a grid to that exactitude, we could conceivably reproduce this, which was the idea, that artists would be able to use the grid to reproduce figures, both large and small, as needed. So here's a close-up of the lower left part of that scene that we just saw. And the proportions were kept consistent, as I said, through the use of grids and lines. And I will let you guys read this on yourself. It goes into some detail about how they did it. And then the paintings were most likely planned on papyrus paper and then later transferred to the tomb walls by an artisan using the grid system as an aid. And then seated figures occupied 14 squares between the soles of the feet and the hairline because the thigh and the knee are no longer included in the stature. They're seated. And here is a slide where you can see this is the bottom of somebody's robe and their feet. And then you can see where somebody carefully started to mark out the grid, which would have been laid out in red paint, and a lot of times the grids were actually uneven, and it's clear that the artists weren't trying to aim for mathematical accuracy. The lines were just an aid to drawing an acceptably proportioned human figure, and the artist did not have to follow them slavishly. And then during the 11th century, there was a new type of statue introduced, known as the block statue, which I showed you in the earlier slide. Boop, boop, back there. There he is. So this is actually a New Kingdom figure, but it shows the style of statue very well. So basically it reduces the form of the body to a block. And the subject is shown seated on the ground with his knees drawn up to his chest and then his arms resting on his knees. And as you can see, the body is wrapped in a very tight-fitting garment. You can almost imagine having something wrapped around yourself like that, and only his head, his hands, and his feet emerge. And then the surface of the garment is a great place to write inscriptions. And then once introduced, this remained a common type all the way into the Ptolemaic period, but from its inception, it was used almost exclusively to portray male subjects. So now we come to our conclusion, and then we'll go into another period of disruption. So to conclude our our chapter here, an outstanding feature of the art produced in the post-unification 11th dynasty is the reversion, for ideological reasons, to traditional Memphite models. Although the resulting style was of high quality, one cannot help but feel somewhat sad that the striking pre-unification Theban style was so abruptly jettisoned. The uniformity of style found throughout the country during the earlier 12th dynasty can be seen as a result of the centralized control exerted through the royal workshops of the political capital, now once again in the north. And during that time, the quality of artistic production for the king and the upper elite reached a high point that, although equaled at later periods, was never surpassed. And so when we get into the seventh chapter, we will see how things get disrupted again, and we will see a foreign group coming in to rule Egypt. So with that, I leave you, and I hope you all have a great day and a great week, and I will talk to you all soon.